Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome our deputy editor, Will Shu from UCLA. And the title of his presentation today is A Day in the Life of an Editor. Will,
Well, thank you so much.
take it away.
Thanks, Chuck. And, had I known that both you and Jeff would be on, honestly, there's much better speakers on this topic than I would be. But, I definitely tried to title my talk as the day in the life of a deputy editor, in a sense that, it's certainly, first of all, I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be part of a journal and to really, particularly Radiology AI, to be part of it since the very beginning. And a lot of my talk is really just my personal experience. Certainly when I came into this, I did not have a CV full of editorialships or anything like that. So I came in with literally almost no experience other than having reviewed some papers myself. But through the last few years in working with Chuck, as well as all of my co-deputy editors, learned a lot through the process. And hopefully I can kind of instill some of that on you guys, particularly, especially if you're interested in going into academic medicine and research. Part of peer review is definitely going to be a aspect of your job, and being able to do it and to both help the community, but also to strengthen the science that is both published as well as what authors receive in terms of feedback, I think is a real value in a lot of what we do. So just to briefly introduce myself, so I'm from the University of California, Los Angeles, here in Los Angeles, California. I'm part of the Medical and Imaging Informatics group. It's a group that's been in the Department of Radiology for several decades. This was a picture from pre-pandemic, so this is the last time we got together and took a large group picture. But our motto is really, we want to use informatics and data science to re-engineer healthcare by using the data to improve both the outcomes of patients and overall to be able to make better decisions. And so my interest in my research is really in this idea of integrating multi-scale, multimodal data. So this is actually a picture from taken from a paper published by Faisal Mahmood over in his lab in Harvard, and he makes much more beautiful pictures than I do. So I took his picture, but it does essentially summarize the same thing, which is we're interested in taking medical records, radiology, pathology, genomic data, and integrating it to make better decisions. And so a lot of work that's been going on in this space, as you guys probably know, a lot of relationships and correlations going on and being discovered between radiology and pathology, being able to look at what we see on an MRI scan and correlating with specific histopathology that you may see on a cellular level, and then even to the molecular level. And so one example of this in breast cancer is really being able to look at a mammogram, predict, the histologic subtype of it, and even whether or not there is a BRCA1 mutation. So these are all works that have been published, and certainly there's a lot of opportunities in using this information, but there's also a lot of challenges. And so my lab in particular is interested in how do we mine this data and make more both robust and generalizable discoveries from the data. How do we make it interpretable in the sense that, we're discovering all these associations? How do we, correlate that or understand what the biological significance of that is? And ultimately to build models that can be translated into practice. And so just to hit that home, a lot of my work is in lung cancer. So one example of this is being able to look at and characterize CT scans over time. And so maybe in a screening exam like this one, a low-dose CT, you don't see anything in the initial image, but then over time there's some nodule that forms. And so some of the work that we're interested in doing is looking at the biological reasons why this may occur. And so this is, for those of you guys who are familiar, it's the hallmarks of cancer. And so looking at how do we tie in the biological information with the imaging data, really with the goal of seeing if we can extract more biological information from the images. And so really some of the predictions that we're interested in doing is whether it's cancer, is it aggressive, and potentially downstream treatment. And so two goals. One is to advance the ability to extract biological insights and actionable information using electronic health record data, as well as to develop and validate computational tools to harness this data for management of individual patients. And so those are kind of longstanding interests. And areas that I work in are lung cancer, prostate, breast, and colon, using a variety of methods, including deep learning, but ultimately it's whatever kind of modeling paradigm that fits the data. And certainly, working very closely with clinicians to see how that works. Jeff, I see. Did you want to make a comment? Oh, I guess not.
No, I'm sorry, Bill. My fault.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Okay, great. And so yeah, so that's me. Let me kind of get into the topic of today. So what I want to cover today is really just, again, my experience of being part of a journal in the editorial board, as well as a deputy editor capacity. And so some of the things I'll try to motivate is why be an editor, why, we were just joking earlier when everyone was joining in, how, the title of this talk really could be Night in the Life of an Editor, because a lot of times we're basically doing this on our spare cycles at night, and so why put ourselves through this, right? So that's one question I'd like to answer. What is it that editors actually do? And some of the challenges that we face, and some takeaways that I hope as reviewers and as part of the Training Editorial Board, you guys can hopefully take away and think about as you do reviews and participate in the editorial process. So why be an editor? I mean, this is my perspective, and my kind of reason why I participate is one is that it's really unique in the sense of being able to see the field at a very broad perspective. So as you can see from this kind of image, being able to stand at the mountaintop and kind of look down and see all the work that's going on. One of the real joys of being part of an editor and reviewing papers is really seeing the variety of work that's coming in. A lot of times being at the cutting edge, right? Because for the papers that are actually published, it's obviously a long lead time in terms of the review process and then the copy editing and the actual publication. That's certainly changed a bit now that a lot of online publications are speeding up how papers are getting published. But ultimately, we're at the very beginning where papers that are coming in are really representative of the kind of the late breaking work that authors are doing. And so being able to kind of be at the top and see all the work that's going on, and especially in the radiology AI space, seeing what people have been interested in and where people are working has been really fulfilling. And certainly, at least as a researcher for myself, being on top of that literature has been really helpful, both in understanding what's going on, understanding what the state of the art is. And so that's been really a huge kind of educational benefit for me, being part of this process. Another aspect is kind of the critical thinking aspect. And so, with every paper that we get, I think the far majority, if not all of the papers, have really, requires a lot of kind of thought, particularly as we think about, papers that are whether or not the design is correct, whether it addresses the question that originally was sought after in terms of, what was the hypothesis being posed, whether the authors made their kind of a compelling argument for kind of what sort of their conclusions, was it supported by the evidence that they're showing. All of these require critical thinking, and also in terms of just the presentation of the work, whether we think that in the amount of words that the authors were given, that they're able to clearly articulate kind of how they went about solving the problem, and whether they presented data in a way that is transparent and understandable. And so all of these things require careful reading, and certainly as part of the review process, it's really important to take that time to read, because sometimes it's really easy to kind of gloss over papers and kind of just skip certain sections. But ultimately, we want to make sure that the science and the papers that we do publish are really, can stand up against, scrutiny. And I think part of that is really being very careful in terms of reviewing it and making sure that things that are in the paper it's clearly explained, and that we ourselves understand what is being presented. And so that's been also a huge part in terms of being able to just hone critical thinking skills. And then also networking. Many of you guys have participated in our editorial board activities like this one, where we can get together and kind of chat about research and some topics, and also the in-person meetings that happen at RSNA. I think I actually was fortunate to be part of a student editorial board for the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, or JAMIA. That was over 10 years ago or so, and it was huge in terms of just meeting people who are on the editorial board. They tend to be, the sort of the who's who in the area of informatics. And so likewise here, being able to network both with Chuck, with Jeff, and, others, to really be able to get to know one another and to get to know one another in this community. And so I think it's really a unique opportunity to just learn from others, but also to get to know one another. And you never know what benefit that may have later on, particularly as you look for jobs or go out into the world, and you may actually find a really great collaborator through all of this. And so what do editors do? And so I like this comic partly because I do this in my lab, where I joke about doing this in my lab, where, as a professor, a lot of what we do is basically mentor students, but then take credit of a lot of the work that our trainees do. But, editors, same way, right? I mean, a lot of times it's you guys, particularly as the reviewers, as the sort of the first kind of the front line in terms of people who are reading these manuscripts and giving us feedback. I mean, you guys are doing a lot of the hard work in terms of critically appraising and understanding the papers. And as editors, a lot of what we do, I mean, we have to do the same in a lot of ways, but because we do a lot of this for across many papers, we do rely a lot on the opinion and of the critiques that you guys provide us. And so, as I go through what editors do, I mean, part of it is really dependent on some of the insights and kind of the opinions that you guys give. So if you ever have that feeling like, oh, am I writing this review and no one's really reading the review, it's absolutely false. I personally read the reviews, and I definitely value a lot of the comments and the feedback that you guys give in your reviews, and that's been really fantastic. In the sense that you guys pick up a lot of things that I personally may not have missed or may have missed in my own personal review. And so one is that editors are always behind the ball in terms of underwater. And so, when this is not my cue, fortunately, this is actually a sort of a view of the sort of the journal as a whole. And so, of course, we have multiple deputy editors and one editor-in-chief, but, we basically there's a lot of manuscripts that are going through the system. And so, a lot of times we are in we have the support of a really great staff that, helps us with the management of the manuscripts and making sure that we're not, any manuscript is not being, forgotten or dropped through the cracks. And of course, helping us with reviewer selection and all that. But ultimately, as editors, we take responsibility for the manuscripts in our queue. And so we too need to make sure that, we stay on top of it, that the reviewers are assigned, that reviewers are getting back to us in a timely manner, but also for the manuscripts that have kind of borderline recommendations or conflicting recommendations, figuring out what to do with them. And so some of the tasks, and this is not all inclusive, and of course, would love to hear from our seasoned editors, whether or not they want to add anything here. But, some of the tasks include evaluating new submissions to determine the fit and editorial standards for the journal, overseeing the paper review process, selecting and inviting experts, ensuring the assignments are complete, analyzing the feedback of the reviewers, synthesizing reviewer inputs and making a decision. So, oftentimes I read the reviews, I read the paper myself, and then I have my own paragraph that I write as a deputy editor that will communicate kind of the rationale for our decision. And this also gets sent to the editor-in-chief for their sign-off. And then finally, to discuss borderline cases with the rest of the editorial team. And it's not just borderline cases, but at least in the Radiology AI journal, as many of you guys have experienced by participating in our editorial board meetings, we actually discuss any paper that ultimately we think could be accepted, so that, again, the standard-wise, we just want to be consistent in what we're accepting, and just making sure that all the editors are aware of what papers are being published. And so this can cycle itself, right? So for papers that are, major revisions, we would need to do a new review process, or maybe sometimes we reject it and tell them, hey, we're interested, but you need to redo, aspects of your study and then resubmit, and we reconsider. And again, that could also be a sort of a repeat process. So this is a sort of a cycle that occurs. And then there's other things that I personally do not directly involve myself in, but sometimes it comes up like handling appeals, so that goes to the editor-in-chief, and then sometimes it gets pulled in terms of an opinion about whether or not the appeal is something that should be moving forward, to help build a community around shared interests. So as you know, for our journal, there's a lot of different activities that are involved, like the tweet chats and the sort of the podcast. So these are other things that build a community and build interest in the journal, and also to steer the direction of this journal. And so part of I guess one of the thrills of being part of a journal is that, you have an audience and you have a natural kind of a platform to say how you think science should be disseminated in this field. And so when we talk about standards of reporting, or how do we share data, how do we share models, these are things that as a journal that there is definitely a sort of again, a platform to kind of opinionate or even enforce some policies for manuscripts that are coming into the journal. There's also a role in managing conflict of interest. And as Chuck was mentioning just at the beginning, there's of course a lot of challenges here. One of the things that as editors, we're not exempt from is making sure that we ourselves are not in any appearance of a conflict of interest. Of course, this process needs to be, viewed objectively, and that as editors, we also need to be very cognizant of when we think that we may not be able to provide a objective opinion on a manuscript. So some of the easy ones is that, the editor is a co-author on a manuscript. Obviously, we cannot oversee that the review of that manuscript. Authors from the same institution, and so that occurs a lot because University of Pennsylvania, which two of our co-editors our editors are from. Of course, that comes up a lot. UPenn is a very productive university, so we see a lot of conflicts there. And so we handle that, right, in terms of making sure that those who are not in conflict are handling the manuscripts and getting outside editors or opinions as needed. And so there's actually consulting editors that handle some manuscripts when Chuck is conflicted, for example, and other scenarios that may give an appearance of COI. So, for example, just like some of you guys may eventually get invited to review grants, and this is the same thing where in grant reviews, anytime that you are, for example, collaborating with someone who's working on a manuscript, or actually looking for a job at a university that submitted a grant, sometimes that becomes a conflict. And so that may not be the case here. And of course, things need to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. But there are certainly other scenarios where if you feel like, there is an appearance of conflict, and that people may look back and say, hey, was that really an objective review, or was there a conflict there? We want to avoid that. And so those are things that, I think as editors, we consider, but also as reviewers, you guys can feel free to reach out to us if you ever have a question about, potential conflicts. In terms of evaluating a new submission, some of the questions that I, ask myself when I kind of look at both the reviews that you guys generate, but also, when I read the paper myself is the topic important and of interest to the readership? And so there's a lot of topics out there that people can write on, but some topics honestly have been published a lot, or, there's nothing really novel in what the authors are doing. And so we try to assess those and to see, is it a good fit for the journal as well as for the leadership? Is there clinical significance? Now, oftentimes you think, well, there's a lot of journals out there in the space of AI, of data science, of even imaging informatics. And so how do we differentiate ourselves? Well, a lot of times what we'd like to do, given our audience and given our affiliation with RSNA, is, to make sure that there is a clinical significance, that there is a clinical application that comes out of the work that's being done. And then does the paper meet initial editorial QC? So here is what we call a desk kind of assessment, where when a paper comes in, it comes to my queue, and the first thing I do is just look at the paper and see, is this paper worth the reviewer's time in looking at? And so, I look at the data set, the sample size, the techniques. Are they appropriate for the work that they're doing? Does this work overlap too much with existing work from the authors or from other, institutions? And so maybe the authors didn't do a literature review, and so they kind of just assume that it was novel, but it's not. So these are things that, when I feel that, when I look at this and I say, hey, I don't think this is worth the reviewer's effort to really go through, because it's clearly not in a form where we think it could be publishable, then that becomes a desk reject. So that is essentially, what happens in this type of this initial review. And so whenever I'm in kind of a sort of a 50-50 in terms of, okay, not sure, then I of course err on the side of pushing it through. But definitely the ones that I feel strongly like, there's some clear issues with the manuscript off the bat, then those are the ones that I probably would not bring forward for a review, for further review. And then also choosing the right reviewers. And this actually is where the staff has really been helpful. And I think, we have our databases and systems that have self-reported keywords for individuals. Also knowing people in the field that have research interests that align well with the papers. And then also figuring out how to balance the reviewers between the clinical and technical experts. And so, for a lot of these manuscripts, there are some manuscripts where I think the title, it just brings a lot of interest, or the abstract brings a lot of interest, and so there's a lot of reviewers. Other papers, it's really, really hard to find reviewers. And again, these are things that I think it's a heroic job on the staff's part. Sometimes I chime in, but mostly the staff, to try to find the right people to review the paper. And sometimes it requires some specialized reviewers. So there's sometimes, like, for example, we're seeing an uptick in papers that may be evaluating AI, and maybe even doing a clinical trial of an AI algorithm, in which case then having a stats reviewer to assess study design off the bat is really important. And then also, as an editor, I do a quality of the review, and the quality assessment of the review. And so this is something that actually, for the most part, I haven't had an issue with trainees. Sometimes I see it more of an issue with the more senior investigators who probably don't have time to really do a real thorough review. But I asked myself, for these reviewers, did they provide a thorough review, or was it kind of cursory? Did they misunderstand the manuscript? Sometimes that actually happens. You read the review and you're like, I don't think they got the actual point of the manuscript. And so there is actually situations where you can kind of rescind a review, and luckily I haven't done that in recent memory at all. But it's something that can happen for reviews that are just not on point, and we don't think it's actually helpful for the authors to see the review. But I do think that, in terms of the quality review, just being consistent in kind of making sure that when the authors receive the reviews, that they both get intelligible reviews that clearly shows that the reviewers have thought about the paper, understood it, and then also provide constructive feedback. But also, to, at the end of the day, there could be differing opinions of reviews, but ultimately, each review kind of provides some constructive information on why the manuscript may have been accepted or not accepted. And so, and ultimately, I also want to make sure that the reviews are objective in terms of, again, that there's no statements of strong bias or things where it's clear that the reviewer just, for whatever reason, strongly disagreed with something, and that, it just became a overarching theme of the review that, it was a kind of a personal conflict, things like that, that I need to kind of address. And so in those cases, of course, I would probably reach out to the reviewer to kind of discuss. But in many cases, though, and I would say I haven't encountered many of those. I think the most frequent issues I've seen is just cursory review in terms of just the level of detail, and then also, just some statements where sometimes it could be kind of interpreted the wrong way by the authors, and being able to address those. So I'll make some of those specific comments later on. And so then where I come in terms of my own review is really then synthesizing these comments. One of the kind of questions that we ask as an editorial group, and I don't remember if it's the top 25% anymore. I know we've been moving the needle downwards because we've just been, raising the bar in terms of the types of the quality of paper that we get. So maybe it's top 15% now, but basically we ask ourselves, is this at the top of the crop in terms of the paper that we see? And so, if it is, then that may be publishable. If not, then, how much work is it needed to get the paper to a publication level? So sometimes that requires a lot of clarification, which may be okay, right? Because the experiments have been done. You're just asking the authors to answer questions that may be open about the methodology. But sometimes it requires additional experiments. And so, some of the thought process I have is that, when there's a lot of experimentation that needs to be done, then those tend to be rejects. And then, maybe an invitation to resubmit as a new submission. But those that are clarifications could be ranging from, minor to major revisions. And so these are things that we keep in mind as we kind of look at, or I look at the paper. And then sometimes I need to read between the lines. Actually, this is something that happens not just sometimes, but, I think there's oftentimes we have reviewer scores. As you guys are familiar, we ask you guys to rate the paper on a Likert scale, and sometimes those scores don't match the comments. Like, it's very strongly positive on the reviewer scores, but then the actual review is quite negative, and so we have to reconcile that. And also things that are not mentioned in the review. Sometimes reviews are very they kind of are very complementary to the paper, but then there's some fundamental issues that the reviewers had that aren't just were articulated very nicely, I guess, in the science of a kind way. But then it's actually really important to bring out some of those issues, because that's ultimately what we need to make clear to the authors, why their paper was ultimately rejected. And so these are things that I have to do as a deputy editor to kind of see how do we make the best decision based on kind of the information that's coming in through the reviews. And we often discuss papers. And so on a weekly basis, many of you guys, again, have been part of this on the Wednesdays. We come together, we summarize the manuscripts, overall idea, strengths and weaknesses. And part of the reason why we have these calls is, number one, is that, maybe there was a perspective that as an editor myself, I may have missed. And, my background is more technical. Certainly, there's a lot of clinical applications that I may not see as, and understand. And so these are things that that as colleagues on the call that may have that kind of clinical background would be able to provide some motivation on maybe why a paper is really innovative from a clinical perspective. What to do with conflicting reviews, and this happens a lot, right? When you have a major revision and actually an accept and a major revision, right? So how do you reconcile those sort of differing opinions? Are the editors consistent in what is being accepted? And so this is something that, as we discuss papers, we can kind of calibrate ourselves to see how other editors feel about a certain paper, and really with the goal of becoming more consistent as a group. And all of this then results in some type of anonymous vote that we then poll the group to see what we want to do as a next step. And so with that, I want to just say that, being part of a journal, and especially Radiology AI from the early days, I see it as almost like building a house, right? And where, we started with a hole in the ground, and we slowly constructed a foundation and a shell, and then now kind of doing sort of these fixings and the interior and all that. And, in the early days of this talk, and I've given this talk maybe 3 or 4 times, I would say that the journal was really at the foundation level, right? And building a framework and building sort of a structure. But I would say that, we're reaching that point where there's a lot of maturity in what we do, and kind of, we've set a sort of an expectation for authors. Authors know about us and submitting work. They know the type of quality that we expect. And so we're still building. I would say is that there's still a lot of areas where we are kind of growing and trying to kind of complete this house, but we certainly are much more mature over the since the beginning, and that's a lot of credit due to Chuck as well as the editorial board in helping kind of shepherd this whole journal forward. And so, we are one of many in this big pond. Of course, each journal has their own focus, and I think that's where one of the things I mentioned earlier was the idea that as a journal, we need to find our identity and why, and kind of our niche in this area. And I think that really has been something that we've been doing and growing, particularly as every time we accept a paper, it is telling the authors and prospective authors and the readers about who we are as a journal. And so that's why it is so important to kind of follow a very rigorous editorial process. And we have this ability to set the bar. And so, early on, Chuck and Linda and others published a paper for a checklist for artificial intelligence in medical imaging or claim. And, it has become sort of a basis of an initial checklist for authors who submit to the journal to make sure that they're reporting different facets of their study. And I think that in itself has raised the bar in the types of papers and the consistency of the papers that we see that are being submitted. Also, there's a lot of other kind of policy things that need to be worked through. Like early on, we knew that the community in the AI world likes to publish their papers on preprint servers. And so that was something that was not allowed within radiology at the time. And so there was a lot of push to try to make that available. And so our journal now allows for preprints to be out there as long as they're appropriately acknowledged as part of a submission. And of course, there's a lot of ongoing discussions like how do we host data sets, whether we are going to, archive models and make those available to enforce certain standards. So these are all things that I think, are very big problems in the AI space and certainly warrant a lot of discussion. And so these are things that, may be beyond the scope of what a single journal can do, but it certainly, again, could be something that a journal can participate in the conversations. And I know there's definitely a lot of ongoing conversations, both within the journal as well as through the AI working sort of committee, informatics committee on how to position RSNA in this area. And then, of course, there's a lot of different ways to assess impact. And these are just two examples where, one metric is looking at the number of kind of interactions on social media and how many people are viewing this, these papers and like Mendeley. So that's one kind of metric of just interaction of, how many people are kind of interacting and responding to a paper. Another one is, of course, the impact factor, or more formally known as the journal citation report, and seeing, impact that. Of course, no bibliometric sort of metric, I guess, is infallible. And so, there's a lot of pros and cons for each one of these, but they certainly are, different metrics that as an editorial board that we do look at. But of course, there's a lot more than just these individual numbers to assess the value of a journal. Okay, so I'm going to try to transition a little bit into some potential headaches of editorial sort of as an editor we face. We'll start one with kind of what I would consider like a worst nightmare scenario. And that is the idea of like a retraction. Now, retractions themselves, to me, and this is my personal opinion, is, I think sometimes it is natural for scientific work to need a retraction or some type of revision. And that's part of pure science, where sometimes it's something like an error in a code or things that as an author we may overlook. And then the public, when this knowledge is disseminated through a paper that's well written and code that is shared transparently, a group may come in and say, hey, actually, there was a bug in your code and that may have affected your results. And so maybe at that point, there does need to be an update. And so I'm not to say that it's, it's horrible to have a retraction, but it is one where there is some foul play involved in terms of, for example, this was early on in the pandemic where there was papers that were published in, the Lancet, and I think it was New England Journal, where they talked about the coronavirus and kind of sort of the treatments, and the issue was that the data was pretty much, people were thinking that was just made up. And, because there were a lot of questions about what was reported from the different hospitals, and the data set itself was not transparent. It was from a company that was not being transparent. And so some of the ethical concerns that may come up are authors did not disclose prior publications of the work. And here, again, preprint is important to report, and sometimes it's easy to forget, but it really is important for us, particularly because there are systems in place to check for plagiarism, and certainly preprint servers are part of that. So even if you don't report it, oftentimes we will know about it because it will come up in terms of the plagiarism score that our system returns. Work is nearly identical to something that was already published by the authors. So, there does need to be separation between, what was prior work that may have been published before, as well as current ones. And the manuscript was written and sponsored by a company. So this is still ongoing, as we talked about earlier, ongoing discussions about how to handle these types of conflicts of interest. And there's also on the side of the reviewers about ways that reviewers could actually manipulate the peer review process. So this is one where Elsevier was investigating hundreds of peer reviewers for manipulating citations, and that's actually a huge could be a huge a challenge where, as a reviewer, sometimes you think, hey, I have work in that exact space and it would benefit me if the paper would cite my work. And so then I'm going to start suggesting citations. And we have to be very careful here, right? Because here, definitely there could be, because you are in a position where you're trying to influence the authors, particularly since they're trying to get their papers accepted, to say, hey, if you cite my work, then, somehow I'm going to give you a better review. And I think, we need to protect against that. And so these are things that we do need to be, as reviewers, very careful about what review or papers that we recommend to add as part of citations. What I end up doing is I tend to suggest citations. Definitely that's not my work, but maybe reviews, or just point authors to different papers to say, hey, you may want to check this out. It seems very related. And, you may want to compare your approach to that. But really that's the extent. And we do need to make sure that we're not trying to influence, journals, or citations to journals or to authors' own work. And I think there's also the example of journals that require papers to self-cite other journal papers, which, again, are things that I personally think would not be a good show for the journal. There's also the situation of conflicting reviews, as I mentioned before. So, you have different reviewers and they will give you different spectrum of reviews, like reject no further consideration all the way to accept. And, the reviewer doesn't even want to see the paper again. And so this actually happens more often than you think. And so, again, this is where, as an editor, I try to read the reviews and read between the lines. Sometimes some reviewers are strongly more harsh than other reviewers, but others, maybe they just have a slightly different kind of interpretation of the paper. And then also, how do we reconcile it with the scoring, right? As I mentioned before, sometimes the scoring doesn't always match with the written review. And so what we end up doing is we do discuss these as part of the editorial board meetings. And whenever there is a question in my mind, I personally love to have the feedback and the input from others in the editorial board about their thoughts on the paper. And so I mentioned this already. So, basically we oftentimes with conflicts get other experts to weigh in. Sometimes we realize that the expertise wasn't already on the review in terms of who were invited. So maybe we'll add additional reviews to kind of round it out. We'll discuss with other editors, but at the end of the day, it's really a best judgment call. And we do our best to try to give everyone a fair chance. But sometimes we just have to go with our gut and say, this is maybe very close to borderline, but at the end of the day, may not be, one that rises to something that gets published. Okay, so I'm going to just conclude and would love to hear some thoughts or some perspectives from others here. But, at the end of the day, I see, again, we have a huge opportunity both in radiology AI, but any journal that you're part of, really, where a journal should aspire to be the top destination for authors to contribute their best and highest impact pieces related to to the field. And so I think for us, having been relatively new, it was really building a reputation for being fair and rigorous. And I think that's certainly, at least when I talk to others, and maybe it's a little biased sampling because, they probably know that I'm a deputy editor, so they're not going to tell me all the bad things. But, we do want to build a fair reputation. And I think we've been doing that, at least from the feedback I've gotten. And to process reviews and decisions in a timely manner. This has always been a big challenge. And I can tell you from my own queue that I see a lot of red numbers, which tell me every day that I'm late on getting something through. And I think the more and more, I realize that, authors, they wait around. I mean, I personally have had experiences with journals where it can go months without hearing anything, and it gets frustrating as an author. And I think one thing that we could do as a service to our authors is really getting back feedback to them, making sure that if the paper is not going anywhere really in the journal, that we get back to them sooner than later. And then when we do get back to them, that we have very concrete, recommendations as well as constructive criticism for them to improve the paper. So we're very careful about how we decide whether to do revisions, because sometimes we don't want to go into like a second or third major revision and then ultimately reject the paper. That is very frustrating both to the authors but also to the journal, because we spent a lot of time on it. And so these are things that we want to do earlier on by doing a very complete and objective review at the very beginning. And regardless of what you think of the work, we try to write very careful, constructive reviews. And in the very beginning, I would say that I saw a large variety of different ways people write their reviews. It's been a lot more consistent, at least more recently. And I think that has to do with a lot of, things that you guys hear from these calls, but also just, as we go along, you can kind of read your reviews for your peers, because I think you guys get all the reviews once the decision is made. And when I used to read through it, sometimes I would have to identify and correct for certain language about, like, language that may sound a little bit either derogatory in terms of, what was being said to the authors, or, in terms of just, something that would be stated a little differently that could be taken a different way, right? So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the authors at this point and say, hey, how would I would like to receive this, this feedback? I mean, if I said that, yeah, this is useless information or useless experiments, of course, fundamentally that may not be false, right? It could be, the experiment was just not done correctly, but it doesn't have to be phrased that way, right? And so these are things that I think, as a group, we want to make sure that we give this feedback to the authors in a way that they can accept and also hopefully respond to in terms of improving their work. And so some just final takeaways. Try to set aside time to do a review, and I'm very guilty of this myself, where sometimes I find myself procrastinating, and then at the end of the day, like waiting till last minute to finally do a review. And I just feel like, I can see the difference between that type of review that is more cursory than ones where, I get the paper and I read it and I have time to think about it and then formulate a very kind of well-constructed review. And I would say the reality is going to fall somewhere in between those two, because we're just busy people. We don't always have time to kind of do that for every paper. I hope that, as you think about writing reviews, that you present a balanced view of the strengths and weaknesses. Is really helpful as a reviewer, as an editor, I should say, to see strengths and weaknesses from the reviewers. Like, if you can tell me what are the top few strengths of the paper and top few weaknesses, that helps me kind of focus in on what I think are, making the argument again about why a paper should or should not be accepted. And clear points supporting the strengths and weaknesses are very helpful. And these are things that I personally use when I then, bring up papers for discussion in a group setting, as well as when I write my own deputy editor comments. Be concise but specific about certain critiques. And here, if there are very specific, and I think all of you guys have done a great job in writing critiques that are very concrete and sometimes very, very specific in terms of what kind of verbiage should change and all that. And that's great. I would just say avoid very blanket statements without any examples or without elaborating, because oftentimes those blanket examples are hard to interpret for authors. And so I think these are things that the more concrete we can be, the easier time that the authors will have in shaping the manuscript in a direction that we would find it publication or publishable. And then also know the limits of your knowledge. Now, I know this is a very broad field, and so it's really hard to know everything all at once. And so definitely we are a team. And so, you know, you don't have to pretend like you know the stats component of it and to try to, you know, pass that off as knowing it, but rather, you know, be honest in terms of when you send me comments. So you have the option to write comments to the authors, and of course you have your critiques there. But also I appreciate comments directly from you in the comments to the editor, where you can be very honest and say, yeah, you know, maybe this area I wasn't so sure of, or this is not my strength. And so that helps me as I kind of consider the different reviews where there may be missing expertise. And you can also be very blunt about, you know, your thoughts of the paper in terms of, you know, if you felt like you wrote a paper review that was very constructive, but then you felt very strongly that this should not be accepted, please do let me know in those comments to editors. And finally, thank you for your hard work. I mean, again, this is something that as a teamwork and something that I personally wouldn't be able to do without you guys giving me such great reviews and constructive reviews. So thank you for all that you do, as well as for the time that you spend on the reviews. I know sometimes it feels a little thankless, but really, I think at the end of the day, you're bit by bit really improving the science and really making sure that this journal just, you know, again, has a reputation of being fair and objective, and a great place for authors to send their high impact work. So with that, I will just end there and open it up for comments or questions.
Hey, Bill, this is Jeff. That was absolutely terrific. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I had one question and one, I guess, comment.
Great.
I'll start with the comment. I, as a former editor of a general radiology journal, I just wanted to reinforce your point about just how important the peer review process is. I think a lot of people recognize that it's very imperfect for a lot of the reasons you described, but it's the best we have. And it is really important, especially when, for example, I'm a thoracic radiologist. I may understand some of the issues as it relates to my particular specialty, but I really rely so heavily on the expertise and the input of others who have expertise that they share with me, so that I can provide proper feedback to the authors uh, and give them substantive reasons as to why we will or will not accept their paper or what they need to do to improve its quality. So I know it's the part of the editorial process that I enjoyed most, because I learn something from every paper I review, and I learn about the literature if I'm not up and familiar with it. And I feel like I've really contributed something worthwhile to the published literature. So that was sort of my one comment.
Yeah, thanks.
The other one, I guess, another comment or question is, one of the things, and it was easier for me to do because I was publishing review papers, but one of the things we try to do, speaking to your issue of how reviewers will be quite variable in how harshly or leniently they score a manuscript, especially as it relates to their particular comments. One of the things we tried to do, I'm not sure how successful it was, is we actually created some tutorials and we had some sessions where we would go through some submissions with permission of the authors of things that we published or didn't publish, and try to go through why one would score for a particular area a manuscript with a particular score based upon the issues related to the submission. So it sort of helped our reviewers, I think, especially those who struggled with understanding how to score manuscripts and evaluate them. It sort of gave them some idea of what we were looking for, and gave them some ability to sort of normalize their scores, so they weren't all assassins, or they weren't all, incredibly lenient. So it's hard to do with a scientific journal, obviously, because there's so many variables. But anyway, just something that we try to do in order to provide some instruction to give, especially novice peer reviewers, people just getting started in the peer review process, some idea of how to evaluate a submission.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, Jeff, and a great comment, and something that maybe could be a good fit for this type of venue, right? In terms of like even the student editorial board, or it doesn't have to be within this the training editorial board, right? Any reviewer, to be able to participate. I think you know, what you suggest is really what we do a lot of times in research, right? Where if we're trying to do like, let's say, get consensus of an annotation or whatnot, we would do these type of activities where we would get together and review a few cases and look at the concordance and maybe do some training around that. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think the challenge will be the scaling of it, whether, you know, because of, you know, these are oftentimes challenges beyond just getting together a small group, right? But we're talking about however many reviewers are in our pool to be able to do that. But I don't know, Chuck, if you had any thoughts as well on this.
Nothing particularly much more than where you guys were with it. No, it's always a challenge. You know, I tell people it's the golden rule. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
review unto others the way you would like a paper reviewed, right? And it's helpful for us, as Will said too. I think often, too often we see people put the same comments in the to the editor and to the authors. The comments to the editors are really meant to be private. You know, the comments to the author, we never, you know, those comments should never say this paper should be rejected or
Yeah.
this paper should be accepted. You really
Yeah.
just want to go through and kind of do a factual analysis of it. But up in the comments to the author, we really value getting kind of that direct line from the reviewers that says, you know, although this paper has some really interesting characteristics, it is not ready for publication, or it, you know, you know, there may be 5 really key things about the paper, but like one of them is just such a major flaw that it renders the rest of it unacceptable. And
Yep.
to have someone to, you know, I can't guarantee we'll agree with you in that
Yep.
assessment, but it does cause us to look into that issue critically and get, you know, the group. And to, as Will pointed out, you know, one of the challenges for an editorial board, you know, the core team such as we now have 3 clinicians and 3 informatics, deep learning, basic scientists and translational scientists in the team. And none of us is expert in everything that comes before us as an editorial team, because we get papers in radiomics, we get deep learning, we get transformer models, we have papers about education. And so the advantage is that if it's a neuro paper, we now have a neuroradiologist, we can send it there. If it's a paper that has some statistical overtones, we can send it to, you know, a person there. And so we really do have kind of complementary areas. But unlike something like Radiology, the journal, where their editorial team covers all of the major disciplines and subspecialties, the field that we have is moving so rapidly that, you know, we're all kind of trying to learn and cover, and in a way that's what makes it, and as Will and I thought, as you said very eloquently, it makes it very exciting and interesting for us to learn from it.
Yeah.
And I was just going to point, maybe I'll real quick point out one other thing, and that the deputy editors don't deal with, but the editor handles, and that is appeals. Your paper may have been rejected, and then we get a paper that comes back where they appeal the decision. That goes to me, and I will reread the manuscript and the reviews. My attitude, quite frankly, is I don't want to relitigate the decision. I'm not looking to say, well, did, you know, this, we were kind of on the fence, should we push it the other way? It's really to make sure that everything was done fairly and appropriately. If maybe there was a reviewer who, as well, you know, completely missed the boat, scored it 9s, but, you know, but really didn't understand what the paper was trying to say. And maybe we have to kind of take that one out of the mix or find another. To date, I think there's been maybe one of the papers that's come up for appeal has gone, and we've allowed the authors to resubmit. Our AED, Associate Executive Director for Publications, Angela Colmone, whom all of you will meet. Angela is she reports to the Executive Director of RSNA and to the board, of which Jeff is a member. But Angela oversees all of the publication activities and the entire staff arm, and in addition was editor-in-chief of Science Immunology. She's a PhD immunologist. So she understands a lot about publishing. And one of the things she said to me early on is, you actually should be happy when people appeal, because it means they really want to publish in your journal. But again, in that process, we try to be fair as well. So I'll pause there. And are there any questions or comments from anyone else here?
It's just kind of piggybacking off of the conversations on reviews. How hard would it be to export, like in an anonymized fashion, like the peer review data we have for Radiology AI, maybe doing some kind of like secondary analysis or meta-analysis, maybe even using machine learning techniques to see like what factors go into, like, I don't know, the paper getting accepted or that kind of. I'm curious, like, if, I don't know, any other journal has done something like that, but I feel like that'd be a good thing for us to do, you know? Have any thoughts on that? Or
do you want to take that one, Will, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. I think you can go a lot of different ways with this. I mean, you probably can train Chat GPT or,
Sure.
to actually look at our accepted papers and write its own paper in some ways. But I think, yeah, no, I don't know, in terms of, we certainly haven't done anything to that level yet. I don't know how granular we can get like backend data like that, but I personally think as sort of like a sort of an internal thing, we can certainly it'd be interesting to take a look. But I don't know if I don't think we have anything like that, and probably it's sensitive to get data like that out,
Well,
since
it's
there's
also
of
kind
course
of a privacy concern, because
yeah.
While the papers that are published are indeed public, right? Papers that have been declined in the review process, we have no right to use. I can go back and view those internally, but I can't do anything with that publicly.
Gotcha. Because I was kind of more like talking about like the reviewer data, like the Likert scale stuff, and not necessarily like anything from the paper itself, but like how we evaluate papers. And
sure,
like,
I mean, would it be helpful for me to know, Kareem, if your mean score was a 2 or an 8, right? Because then I get kind of a sense of as Jeff Klein mentioned, and you should look up the paper if you all haven't seen it already, about zealots and assassins. It's kind of a classic in the literature, and you can probably, if you just PubMed and just search for the word zealots and assassin, you'll probably find it. But it talks about people's reviewing styles and whether they're generally positive, and so you have to kind of know what it's like knowing the operating point on the ROC curve, sort of where they are as a reviewer, right? Well, that's a great question. Any other comments or thoughts for Will?
Thank you for that talk. This is Ellie. Quick question. When you're talking about allocating certain articles to each editor, on the other side, does each editor have a certain quota of, or not quota, but do you track the number of articles accepted by each editor, and is there any kind of analysis there, or any thoughts to feedback to obtain from that metric, or is that not really essential?
So I guess that one goes to me. I don't score the deputy editors, and they all get 1s as for on that scale where 1 is the best, but in fact the journal staff does the work of kind of balancing out the workload to the deputy editors. If paper for special reports, for commentaries, editorials, weird stuff, that goes to me as deputy editor. If it's regular scientific content, it goes to one of our 5 deputy editors. But I have a deputy editor queue for me as well, and I have papers that come in there. But no, so we really do, we try to balance that out for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be challenging. We did something with AJR. I chaired the pubs committee for American Röntgen Ray Society, which publishes AJR, and we changed the editorial model to make the editor-in-chief, instead of like 90%, a 50% job, and then created 10% jobs for section editors. Well, it turned out that the GU section editor probably got 20% of the papers, and so it can be very difficult to kind of balance that load. But that was, and thanks to the RSNA board, we were able to add on another deputy editor this year, and I think that helps us address the workload, and plus it brought another clinician onto the team. That's Mariam Aboyan, who joined us this year, and she's a neurorad and does work obviously in machine learning and radiomics, so that was helpful to us to have some additional coverage on the core team in that area.
Thank you.
Well, I see we're past the hour. It went by fast. Will, thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for a terrific job, and thanks to all of you on our Training Editorial Board for joining us. We really appreciate all the work that you do, and please feel free, if you have further questions, to send along to to Dr. Shu or to me, however we can help y'all out.